कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Welcome to Kitaabnama Books and Beyond, a very special program where we introduce well-known writers and their works to our audience. So today it's indeed a great pleasure to introduce Professor Vidyashadri. He has won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 2014. It's a great honor to have you with us this afternoon. And let me begin by just mentioning a few things that I have heard of your works and you. You were born in Bangalore and then moved to the United States when you were only 5 years old. And you would have memories about your time perhaps in an immigrant family that the audience would like to hear about. But then of course your poetry has been very widely received, and you have also been given other prestigious awards such as the James Laughlin Award for Poetry, and you have published widely in the Paris Review and other prestigious journals. So let me begin by asking you perhaps to recall your memories of childhood.
There are so many that are very rich, and they go so far back, and I think I have early memories of Bangalore. We left Bangalore in the late 1950s, and I have memories of being in Canada and in Ohio, which is where we wound up. And they are just the memories of childhood. They aren't necessarily the memories of being Indian or being an immigrant. You know, a child just experiences things, I think, in the same way. Childhood is universal. And but I was amazed as a child and filled with wonder at the kind of transformations we went through. I was recently in Mumbai, and I remembered that that's where we left from. We flew from Mumbai in 1959, and I remember the India Gate, and in fact there's a picture of me, you know, in my mother's arms with the India Gate behind us. And so it's really fascinating to come back to India and relive those things.
Any memory as to what inspired you to become a poet? How early was that inclination?
The initial ambition was to be a writer, and I think probably a fiction writer. I read novels, and I still read novels assiduously. I think when I was about 16, I fell in love with certain poems. I don't think I had imagined myself to be a poet, but there were poems that I really loved. And because I loved those, I wanted to sort of reproduce them. And these were poems by American poets such as Galway Kinnell and Mark Strand, and poets such as Yeats and Auden, and a little earlier romantic poets such as Keats, and a little into contemporary life, poets whom I knew then who were my contemporaries or near contemporaries. And that's when the poetry bug took hold, and it started growing and growing, and then it kind of consumed me.
From that, let me move you to speak about the book collection that has won the award, which is 3 sections. And in that, you have spoken about childhood, you've spoken about the experiences of the human consciousness. In fact, the citations for the Pulitzer Prize mentions the very wide range of human consciousness that you have captured in your poems, from childhood to dementia. And reading your book, 3 sections in particular, It's an amazing range that you have there. So I'm actually not surprised to hear from you that all the way from Auden to Yeats, there were poets who influenced your thinking. But looking at this range, you know, there is compassion in your poems, and maybe you want to talk on some examples of compassion that you write about.
Yeah, I think there are poets who are interested in language primarily. I honor language, but I think I am a realist poet, and I think I'm very interested in humans and human psychology as a source of inspiration and human experience. I am, for example, a poet that has a strong political element in the work. And I'm interested in social life. I think that has something to do, I don't know exactly what, with the fact that I was an immigrant. So society was always problematic for me. It was always something that I felt myself to be on the outside of. And that made me interested in it as a phenomenon. You know, in the way that you would be interested in a tree or an ocean, and that would be an inspiration for a poem. And so I think the human element is a very, very important aspect of my writing, and I see myself as a part of the humanistic tradition. All those poets I just mentioned, for example, they are essentially humanists. They are interested in what is happening to the human being, whereas there are other poets who are interested primarily in themselves, and those are some very, very great poets, of course, but they are not that embedded in society in their writing. I've always been attracted to the public poets. Auden is certainly a public poet. Yeats is certainly a public poet. Robert Lowell is a public poet, and he was very influential to me. Now, a poet like Gary Snyder, a poet of the American West, has always been deeply concerned with environmentalism and the ecology in which we find ourselves embedded as human beings. And a poet like that is also very influential on me. So the variety is broad, but you know, the consistent underlying unity is the interest in the human element.
There is one particular poem which caught my interest, and that one is called Nursing Homes. It is a poem that is based on an understanding of a difficult situation in life, old age, health problems, the difficulties of confronting the health conditions. Now, I would like you to perhaps talk about what brought that poem about.
You know, I am of a certain age where my parents are old and have to be taken care of. And my mother wound up, you know, due to some health problems, in a nursing home for a while. And so I was spending a lot of time visiting her. And the poem grew out of that experience. My observation of people who were in a state of, you know, great age and dementia and experience a degree of decrepitude, but were also intensely human. You know, you could feel the vividness and the vitality of their humanity underneath all of the physical problems. And I felt that it was I would say, a difficult subject. It's not one that poetry tends to approach very much, but I really did feel almost an obligation to at least try to deal with it in a poem. And that was the poem I used. And I don't think I will write another one, but.
In complete contrast to that poem and the notion of compassion that you put in so beautifully in it, you have another poem which is called The Surveillance Report. And that talks about public spaces, which is of interest to you, as you mentioned. But in those public spaces, there are also the sense of being a part of civil society, of being watched, of being accountable for what one does. So perhaps your comments on the surveillance report would be of interest to our audience.
You know, that is very much a political poem that has to do, but not a political poem, but in sort of a narrow sense, but in a broad sense, in that it takes the relationship of the individual to current technology and the ability of forces to observe us, to know exactly where we are, through the use of cameras and the internet and all of these things, and turns it into an existential situation where the self is sort of trapped in a web of modern technological devices that are observing him, you know. I mean, we sort of do live in high security situations, right? And especially in America, a high security state where there are cameras everywhere. And I thought, you know, this would be a great subject for a poem and a great subject for a kind of political satire. And subsequently, with the Snowden revelations about NSA spying on citizens and stuff like that, it really became, subsequent to when I wrote the poem, it really became a part of the news, you know, to recognize how thoroughly governments are capable of observing their citizens at any point. And, but I don't see it, the politics sort of in that poem are subsumed by a sense of the existential situation, you know. So I sort of see the poem as Kafkaesque.
Poetry is something to be spoken out aloud, to be heard by the people. Now, from your vast array of books that we have here, suppose I were to request you to pick up a poem to read. Would you like to make a selection and read to our audience?
I think because we did talk a little bit about immigration, and I will read a poem called Trailing Clouds of Glory. And the title comes from Wordsworth, yeah, from the Immortality Ode. And it's a poem that begins with the notion of immigration, and the title is important because Wordsworth's Immortality Ode is, of course, about the migration of the soul into the body, you know, and the relevant lines are, trailing clouds of glory did we come from God who is our home. And the action of the poem is the recognition of the slow enclosing of experience upon the immortal soul. And so I sort of thought of that in connection with issues having to do with immigration. The efficient cause of the poem was an immigration law that the state of Arizona passed, whereby if you looked like you were an undocumented alien, now, for example, if you looked as if you came from Central America, then the police had a right to pull you over and ask you for your papers. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, and it's a real change in, you know, the way Americans understand the rights of people, the rights of bodies. And so I decided to write a poem starting out from that, but then I moved on into other areas, and you will see how the poem progresses as it develops. Trailing Clouds of Glory. Even though I'm an immigrant, the angel with the flaming sword seems fine with me. He unhooks the velvet rope. He ushers me into the club. Some activity in the mosh pit, a banquet here, a panhandler there, a gray curtain drawn down over the infinitely curving lunette, Jupiter in its crescent phase, huge, a vista of a waterfall with a rainbow in the spray, a few desultory orgies, a billboard of the snub-nosed electric car of the future. The inside is exactly the same as the outside, down to the MC and the yellow spats. So why the angel with the flaming sword, bringing in the sheep and waving away the goats, and the men with the binoculars, elbows resting on the roll bars of jeeps, peering into the desert? There is a border, but it is not fixed. It wavers, it shimmies, it rises and plunges into the unimaginable seventh dimension before erupting in a field of Dakota corn. On the F train to Manhattan yesterday, I sat across from a family threesome, Guatemalan by the look of them, delicate and archaic and Mayan, and obviously undocumented to the bone. They didn't seem anxious. The mother was laughing and squabbling with the daughter over a knockoff smartphone on which they were playing a video game together. The boy, maybe 3, disdained their ruckus. I recognized the scowl on his face, the retrospective maskless rage of inception. He looked just like my son when my son came out of his mother after 30 hours of labor, the head squashed, the lips swollen, the skin empurpled and hideous with blood and afterbirth. Out of the inflamed tunnel and into the cold room of harsh sounds. He looked right at me with his bleared eyes. He had a voice like Richard Burton's. He had an impressive command of the major English texts. I will do such things, what they are yet I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth, he said. The child, he said, is father of the man.
May I put to you a last question, which is about the form of poetry. In the book, 3 sections, which is a poetry collection, there is one section which is called The Fishes of the Pacific. Now, that particular form doesn't look or sound like poetry, yet it's very lyrical. So, what made you put in that particular unit in the book?
The best response I can give you is historical. You know, it is a prose essay. You know, even though it has prose, of course, has music to it, just like poetry. You know, it's a personal essay, and it has a journalistic element to it. I put it in the book because there is a tradition in the West, beginning with Auden's The Sea in the Mirror, which is a book that W.H. Auden wrote in the late 1940s, and continuing with Robert Lowell's Life Studies and Elizabeth Bishop's Questions of Travel, of putting prose memoir in the middle of a book of poetry. And I've always liked those books. I've liked the texture of having prose next to poetry to create contrast and differentiation. I like the physicality of that, you know. I like the way the book is, you know. It's aesthetically satisfying to me. So that's the only reason it's there, you know.
Well, that's a very interesting reason, and I think it does fit in with the tradition that you mentioned. So thank you, Professor Vidyashadri, for being with us at Kitaabnama.
Thank you.
The stories in this book, I have dealt with magic realism basically, and they are from my own experience. From childhood I have thought and felt deeply about things and suffered with all who suffer, and the need to express this finally burst forth into stories and poems after my precious exposure to Tagore. When I started to write stories, I quickly found short story a fascinating form, and my reading also helped me to progress very quickly. I would not be lying if I say my stories are drawn not only from my experience, travels and reading, but also from a fertile inner world of feminine imagination. Now I will read a story which I have dedicated to Franz Kafka, because he is the writer who I follow and love to read. Before the court of law. The man with a flowing beard and turbaned head, clad in a Pathani suit, stood near the gate that had been shut on him. The doorkeeper, sitting on a stool, grinned at him and blinked. "Your case cannot be admitted. You have to come back again," said the doorkeeper. "You have not even let me in. How can you do so?" said the turbaned man, a deep bafflement in his voice. "If you want to go inside through this doorway into the interior where justice is delivered, you have to first face me. There are more powerful doorkeepers inside the court. You have to face each one of them before finally reaching the patio where all the law keepers have their stalls of justice. When you reach there, you will be puzzled seeing so many of them sitting, jumbling things up, prying and baffling the law seekers. They will show you papers with seals and stamps and ask you to sign only if you are able to sign, or else you will have to put your thumb impression on them in the darkest purple ink, said the doorkeeper with a toothy smile to the turbaned man. The man had come from a faraway village seeking justice for his murdered son. He was the victim of a riot that had looted his house, burned down his wheat and taken away his buffaloes. He sought justice for his wife, who had gone mad seeing all this happening in front of her eyes. He had come to the court of law to seek justice for his buffaloes, whom he had bought from the fair with the savings of his life. Back in the village, it had all been so melodious and pleasant. During the summer, when the fields would be lemon yellow with mustard blossom, the sun would pry on the women who went for their morning ablutions behind the well in the bamboo thicket. The women of the village would be up and about, burning the faggot sticks, brooming in front courts, and cleaning the utensils near the tube wells. The jingle of the activities would wake up the men from slumber and stir the village suddenly to life. Men would get up, fold their bedclothes and carry their small kids on their shoulders away to the pond. The turbaned man would move about and hurry past his wife and head towards the shed to check the animals. The buffaloes turned to him with liquid eyes, moving the eyeballs to take him in. He would then stretch out his hand and scratch the base of their necks gently, one after the other. He loved his buffaloes like he did his own son. The turbaned man had come there to seek justice for his buffaloes, who were taken off by the looters and kept without food and water for days together before being sold to the butcher house. The turbaned man had come to seek justice for his murdered son, who was doused in petrol and set on fire in front of their own eyes. He tried to run away to the fields but could not run up till there. He had jumped into a nearby well and died. The turbaned man had come to seek justice for his wife, who had lost her sanity seeing the murder of her son and died later. He had come to seek justice for all those who were murdered and looted. He made a last effort to appeal to the doorkeeper of the court of law. The doorkeeper spoke to him with finality in his tone. Man, know for once that justice is not for vermin like you. The turbaned man sat on the culvert near the door. He grew old sitting there. He started growing roots into the soil. His beard got tangled and matted. His nails became like stones and turned black. His eyebrows hung on his eyes and covered them, and his eyesight started failing. His mouth drooled and his teeth fell off. The dog that sat next to him pleaded with the doorkeeper to allow the old turbaned man inside the court of law. But the doorkeeper was adamant and extremely duty-bound. The turbaned man then dreamt of drinking his buffalo's milk as if it was the nectar of life, and carrying his son on his shoulders while teasing his wife all the way home. He looked up at the huge gate before the court of law and was dumbfounded seeing the statue of justice radiating an effulgent glow. He closed his eyes and heaved a sigh. The doorkeeper went on to stop another justice seeker at the gate who was trying to encroach in the pristine court of law.